What if I told you there's an animal with scales tougher than chainmail and a tongue that, when fully stretched, can reach nearly half the length of its body? And what if I told you that despite these extraordinary traits, it is being hunted so heavily it may vanish in the near future? This isn't a prehistoric creature. It's the pangolin, the only mammal covered in keratin scales, the same material as your fingernails. If you love nature, stick around. This is one animal you probably haven't heard of, but once you see its hidden defenses, you'll realize why its survival matters. Because to understand what makes the pangolin so remarkable, we need to look at its armor first. Think of a creature wrapped in natural armor, so thorough that scientists often call it a living tank. Pangolins wear up to 1,000 protective scales, each made of keratin, the same substance in our fingernails and hair. These tough plates overlap across their bodies in a strict pattern, leaving only the belly exposed with sparse fur. The design is so effective that it's often compared to chainmail and, in some tests, even proves tougher against puncture. When danger approaches, the pangolin pulls its head and limbs inward, coiling into a tight ball. From the outside, it looks like a spiny pine cone or a rolled-up shield, and predators find nothing soft to attack. The leopard has been seen pawing, biting, and testing the armor, only to give up after minutes of frustration. For millions of years, this strategy worked. Simply staying still made the pangolin nearly untouchable. What's fascinating is how these scales gain their strength. Instead of being solid, they stack in layers that redirect force, almost like roof tiles or the nested leaves of an artichoke. Pressure doesn't pierce one spot easily. It spreads across many plates. The result is flexible armor that can absorb shocks and resist cracking. This balance of strength and give is why the pangolin could survive against some of the most powerful hunters on the continent. Yet the same strategy that defeated lions and leopards falters before people. Curling up protects them from jaws, but against a human, it makes capture simple. A poacher can lift the whole animal like a heavy ball, armor and all. What was once an ancient survival tool now leaves the pangolin exposed to a very different threat. And still, this creature is more than just armor. Beyond the shield of scales lies another role in nature, one that has nothing to do with battle. To see why pangolins matter to entire landscapes, you have to look at how they eat and the hidden work they do for the world around them. They've earned the nickname the ecosystem's silent gardener for good reason. Pangolins aren't just armored survivors, they're also vital caretakers of the landscapes they live in, shaping forests, grasslands, and even farmland through the simple act of eating. By feeding primarily on ants and termites, they take on the role of nature's pest control system, keeping balance in check in ways most of us never notice. So how do they find those hidden nests at night, instead of depending on sight or sound? Pangolins follow scent trails with remarkable precision. Their sense of smell is so sharp they can detect insects buried beneath the earth. Once they locate a colony, they unfurl an extraordinary tool, a long, sticky tongue anchored deep near their pelvis, able to stretch nearly the length of their body. Coated in glue-like saliva, it slips into tunnels and chambers, pulling ants and termites out in steady streams. A single adult pangolin can consume over 70 million insects every year. Imagine the pressure that takes off crops, trees, and even buildings vulnerable to termites. Without this steady regulation, ant and termite populations could explode, causing serious damage that ripples through both wild and human environments. But the pangolin's impact doesn't stop at pest control. As they dig, they loosen the soil, carving air pockets that let water and nutrients flow deeper. These small disruptions act like garden tilling on a grand scale, creating microhabitats that encourage seed germination and even provide hiding spots for other small creatures. What makes this balance fragile is how highly specialized pangolins are. They reproduce slowly, usually only one pup after months of gestation, and they're notoriously difficult to keep alive in captivity. That means when their numbers fall, recovery is painfully slow, and there's no safety net of breeding programs to rely on. Their contribution to ecosystems is vast, but their ability to withstand disruption is limited, and this is where the story turns. For all their importance as quiet gardeners of the natural world, Pangolins are disappearing faster than most people realize. The forces driving their decline are not natural at all, but rooted in human demand, profit, and belief. A crisis sweeping millions of these animals out of the wild before many ever knew they existed. This part of the story is often called the billion-dollar lie. Pangolins have become the world's most trafficked mammal, with well over 1 million taken from the wild in just a few decades. The pressure once fell hardest on Asian species, but as their numbers plummeted, poachers turned more heavily to Africa to supply demand. At the heart of this trade is a false belief, one that assigns healing powers to pangolin scales, even though they are made of keratin, the same substance in our fingernails, and have no proven medicinal use. On illegal markets, scales fetch high prices, and the lure of profit drives traffickers to keep shifting methods. They move live pangolins, frozen bodies, or sacks of scales across continents through constantly changing corridors in Africa and Asia to stay ahead of enforcement, even when authorities intercept shipments, sometimes involving tens of thousands of animals. Those seizures represent only a small fraction of the global trade. Networks act like shadow supply chains, tapping into weak law enforcement and corruption in transit routes. Why do people pay so much for something so ordinary? Part of the demand comes from traditional practices in China and Vietnam, where remedies passed down through ancient texts still cite pangolin scales for treating ailments. Though modern science has dismissed these claims, cultural belief keeps them alive. For others, pangolin meat or products serve as symbols of wealth and prestige, turning consumption into a marker of status. Together, these forces sustain a thriving black market worth billions, and they're erasing a species that has walked the earth for millions of years. Organized crime plays a central role. The same groups that smuggle pangolins are often tied to other high-value trades, from ivory to arms. By disguising scales as legal goods and rerouting them through multiple countries, they make enforcement a constant challenge. It's not simple poaching. It's an industrial-scale operation built on misinformation and reinforced by profit. Pangolin's armor, flawless against big cats, is useless here. The urgent question now is whether science can keep pace with this crisis. And surprisingly, researchers are beginning to uncover tools that might expose trafficking networks in ways never before possible. Science is now moving at a pace that matches the urgency of the pangolin crisis. In 2023, researchers took a major step forward by using genetic testing to trace the animal's origins. They created a reference genome by genotyping about 551 wild pangolins from across Africa, and then compared that to 643 scales seized from the illegal trade. This let them track shipments back to their source with surprising precision, sometimes narrowing the location to within about 70 kilometers. What they found was striking. A large share of the seized scales led back to 2 regions in Cameroon, one along the southern border with Equatorial Guinea and Gabon, and another near the western border with Nigeria. Even more troubling, much of the trafficking was traced to areas that should have been safe. The study flagged 17 national parks where poaching was active, showing that simply declaring land protected isn't enough. These maps reveal specific corridors traffickers use, which could allow enforcement teams to actually disrupt networks on the ground rather than reacting after the fact. Perhaps the most unsettling discovery had nothing to do with mapped routes. Genetic tests revealed DNA from a deeply divergent pangolin lineage, one that doesn't match any known species. Scientists have never studied a living individual. All that exists are these traces left behind in seized scales. It suggests that somewhere in Southeast Asia, there may be pangolins science has never described, disappearing before we even recognize their place on the tree of life. Notice how this work does 2 things at once. It gives conservation teams a powerful way to target enforcement right where poaching is happening. At the same time, it shows just how quickly we may be losing animals, including ones we didn't even know existed. It's a race, not just to protect the pangolins we already recognize, but also to safeguard the hidden biodiversity revealed only in fragments through the illegal trade. And that brings us back to the larger picture. Beyond the data, beyond the mystery of undiscovered species, The fate of pangolins now depends on human choices, choices that determine whether this story ends in loss or survival. The bigger picture is that pangolins reveal both the brilliance of evolution and the weight of our responsibility. These animals show us how inventive nature can be, yet their decline reflects the cost of human demand and neglect. There are clear ways you can help. Support rescue and rehabilitation projects that nurse confiscated pangolins back to health and release them into the wild. Refuse products made from pangolins and speak up if you encounter them in markets or restaurants. And share accurate information. Awareness still changes outcomes. Pangolins are quiet, nocturnal, and seldom seen. Whether they remain part of our world depends on what we choose to do together. Subscribe for more wildlife stories and simple actions you can take.